G'day, I'm Ashley Young. I make sharpening gear for the meat industry. Today I'm going to look at sharpening the slicing knife. So to be successful in the meat industry, we need to set up our knives very specific for the job that you're doing. Unlike butchering, where we can have a knife set up that'll do all sorts of boning, slicing tasks, in the meat game, because it's so important, speed, accuracy, and all we do is stand there and cut all day. We need to have the knife set up specifically for the task that we're performing. So today we're going to look at a slicing knife, how we'd set that up, how we'd sharpen it. Then we're going to blunten it and show you how we would each day sharpen it to keep it consistent. So as the knife wears down, what we would do to keep it running at its peak. So I generally use a 6-inch boning knife for slicing. I know a lot of guys use 7, 8-inch knives, bullnose knives and whatnot, but I've always found the simple 6-inch boning knife work best. This one's a Victorinox, probably the most popular knife you'll see in the meatworks. Reasonably easy to sharpen. So this is one we're going to do. So we'll talk about what differentiates a slicing knife from, say, a boning knife or a skinning knife, whatnot. Slicing knife is set up very thin, so we don't want much shoulder on there at all. Generally I like to have the blade hollow ground as well, so to prevent that drag through the fat and meat. We'd rub it. So in my previous video we did a bit of rubbing back, so we want to rub that dead flat. So we want this shape of the knife to be very thin, and when you feel the front of the knife, you can hardly feel it separating the pads of your fingers. But we don't want it too thin, so there's a fine line between thin and overboard. So what can happen if we go way too thin, what can happen, you'll hit the table or a bone or something and the whole edge will collapse. And back in my early days, I know that happened to me a few times. You'd find a rib in a strip line that shouldn't have been there and the whole knife collapsed, and then you're in trouble. So we want to have it thin enough, but don't go overboard. So we'll explain that as we go. Find that point that we want to run it at, and then we'll go on and sharpen it. So pretty much industry standard now, whenever we're working with knives, need to use cut resistant gloves when we're sharpening, covered footwear. So we'll go ahead and put our cut resistant gloves on. And most workplaces will have their own OH&S policy, but I think the way it's going, this is pretty standard practice now. The requirement to wear cut resistant gloves. So guys, make sure you follow the requirements for where you work. So what we're going to use, a coarse 8-inch by 2-inch coarse stone, silicon carbide. We want to quickly thin this knife down and it's important you have one of these in your kit. So what we want to do, we want to put the knife on the stone, so we want it to be flat. Okay, we pick that back of the knife up ever so slightly so the pressure's towards the front of the knife, but we want to get that scratch pattern as far up that knife as we can get it. Okay, so this knife, it's not a new knife. In my previous video we talked about a brand new knife having to remove that factory edge. Because this knife is one that's been used, we don't have to take as long rubbing it back. So we just want to thin that blade out, and that's all it took on that one side. So we're going to switch over and go to the other side. So we can see that scratch pattern is right across the whole blade. This knife here has been previously hologround, and looking at it, if you're lucky enough at your workplace that you do have a hollow grinding machine, I would recommend getting that hologround again, that knife, just to keep that hollow in there, and that just gives you a little air gap in the blade, and it helps it glide through the meat. Okay, we're going to move over to our sharpening kit now. Get our clamp out. And seat the knife just in that groove, about halfway along. Just nip this front screw up till it's firm, and this back one here provides the locking action. That's not going to move, that's what we want. Okay, we want to start off with our 400 grit stone. .25 mark on our clamp here, and we're going to go back and forth, counting. Count that as 1, 2, 3, that's 4. So we should be able to feel a burr after 4 times up and back with that 400 grit stone. So if you can't feel a burr at this stage, it means your knife's too thick. So for a slicing knife, around the 4 times up and back should give you that burr. So that's one of our indicators that we need to remember to indicate our thickness of our knife. So we turn it over, 25 again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, we should have a burr on the opposite side. And we shouldn't be pushing down on this, just let the stone do the cutting. If you're pushing hard on it, you're going to prematurely drag them diamonds out of the stone. So it's light pressure, guys. Got our burr, so we're going to turn it over. We want to cut that burr off the edge now. Just a couple of times, just lightly. Okay, so we've got a burr on both sides of the knife, so now we want to switch to the smoother stones, because from this point on all we're doing is polishing the edge. So we should have reached that center line that I explained in one of my first videos. If you haven't seen that, go back and have a look at that. So now we're going to go to 600 grit. And we don't want to create a burr again. All we're doing now is polishing the edge. So we're just going from side to side so a burr doesn't form. So stay on the 25. And really lightly from here on in. And make sure that rod's not flopping around in the hole there, because that's going to change the angle from the top of the hole to the bottom. So I like to try and keep it in the bottom of the hole. And the beauty of having a good range of stones of different grits, it will actually speed up the process. So if we go straight from the 400 grit to the polishing stone, it's going to take forever to get that polish if at all you do. So by slowly moving up through the grits, it speeds it up and will give you a better result. Okay, so now we're going to go to the 1200 grit. And what we're going to do, going to use a piece of plastic, nylon or a piece of wood. I usually leave these pieces in the kits for this use. So just going to drag it down the plastic and help drag off them bits of metal and burr that could still be hanging on the front of the edge. And again, nice and lightly from side to side. So we want to be keeping that weight off the stone at this point. We want it as light as we possibly can, because all we're doing is polishing that edge. And this is why I'm sort of tilting the knife, so I'm keeping the weight off that stone. And again, I'm going to wipe that down, piece of plastic, the drag off, and then tiny microscopic bits of metal that could be hanging on the front of that edge. So at this point, off the 1200 grit diamond stone, that knife is going to be sharp. For some jobs that would be as far as you'd go. But we're going for a highly polished edge for a slicing knife, so we need to go to that extra step with the polishing stone, and the more work we can put into it with this finishing stone, the better it's going to be for them push cuts that we're trying to do through chilled meat. So moving on to the white stone, and we can see this stone here is dirty, so that the cleaner we can keep this polishing stone, the better result we're going to be. So we're going to give that a quick clean at this point, and to clean it, just any bathroom cleaner is ideal for this. So this is Jif, Gumption, Ajax, any of them type of cream cleansers are the thing to use to keep these stones clean. And as I've said before, we use them dry. You don't need to be using oil or any lubricant on these, they're better dry. So just tiny dab of that Jif on there. You can see how that's lifting all that metal that was already on the stone. And we can do that underwater, that's fine, just make sure they're dried off. Okay, so we can go up and back, we can do circles, because this is removing very little metal, it's just polishing that edge. Okay, and also we want to make sure that we've got rid of all that grit from the previous stones. We don't want to contaminate this stone with the grit or bits of metal from the other stones. And I usually do about 2 up and back passes with this stone. It's not going to form a burr again, because it's removing so little metal, it just speeds up the process when we're polishing that edge. So I'm alternating the scratch pattern up and back, circles. So what we're aiming to do is just remove all them scratches from the edge and make that as smooth as possible. We really want to be keeping the weight off the stone. So we're just finishing it off now, so I'm super light. I'm going to drag it one more time down the plastic. Okay, so now to test the sharpness of that knife, this is just outside of an old Bic pen, but any sort of plastic type will be good for this. So what we want to do is run that down the edge, and it should be silky smooth. Shouldn't be able to feel any nicks or bumps or rough patches, so it should be just like glass, that edge. Also, pass that test, so now it should bite straight into that plastic. As soon as we touch it with very light pressure, it won't skid down it at all. It's biting in both ways. If it skids, it means we've got a rounded point still on that edge, so we didn't do our job properly back at the start. Raising that burr. So getting that burr is super important. If you haven't got that, we're wasting our time going any further. Okay, when you remove it from the clamp, don't just drag it out, because what that does is wrecks the front of the clamp, and then you'll have trouble clamping it. So make sure you undo it properly before you take it out, because what I've done, I've beveled that off so it fits the shape of that knife. So they're actually cut in on an angle. So if you just drag the knife out, what you're going to do is wear the front of that clamp, and you won't get that snug fit, and it'll move around in there. So that's day one, our first sharpening. So now what we're going to do, we're going to blunt the knife and make out that we've used that all day, and come back to day two. What do we do for the second day, and how do we maintain that edge? Okay, so now if we've used that all day, hopefully we've got a full day out of it, or even 2 days. We can see now that knife's thoroughly blunt. It won't bite into the pen at all. So each day we want to come back to our bench stone and just take a tiny bit off the sides of that knife. So if we don't do that, each time we sharpen it, it'll take more and more time to raise that burr. So remember, we used 4 strokes up and back to get that burr. So we need to, if we lightly do this every time, you're not going to run into that problem where your knives have got too thick and it's going to take forever to rub that knife back. So it should only take a few seconds from each side. That should be it. So we're going to wipe that off, back into our clamp, halfway, nip it up, make sure it doesn't move, and then back to our 400 grit stone, making sure they're clean. 25 again, and we're aiming for 4 times to get that burr. Okay, got a good burr. Burr. Drag it down some plastic. .600 grit. And moving from side to side. Okay, 1200 grit. Get our piece of plastic again. Nice and light. Okay, over to our polishing stone. Let's give that a wipe first. So we can see it's not taking much time at all to bring this knife back to razor sharpness. The key is keeping that maintenance up on the bench stone, keeping it rubbed back. taking you 5 or 10 minutes to sharpen a knife, chances are the knife's too thick. And what you're also going to do is prematurely wear out these smaller sharpening stones where you should be doing all your work on that flat bench stone. Okay, so we'll test that again. Beautiful and smooth. Bites in, both sides, along the full length of the knife. Remember to loosen our clamp off properly before we remove it. So there you go, how quickly that took us to resharpen that knife. So there should be no excuse to push a blunt knife all day for the sake of 2 minutes to resharpen it for a day of having a nice sharp knife with less chance of having injuries. To me, it's a no-brainer to go and sharpen that knife when you get a chance. So we would continue to do that each day, giving it a little rub before we sharpen it on the flat bench stone just to maintain that thickness. Then move on to our sharpening. Remember how many it took to raise a burr. You might find 3 times up and back to raise a burr works well for you, but 3 or 4, if it's only taking you one go up and back and you've got a burr, the knife's probably too thin. So we spoke about that earlier on, about a knife being too thin. So that's how you can gauge the thickness of the knife by how many times it takes you to get that burr. And each person's different. The job that they do might be different, but so just a bit of experimentation, but that's just a good guide for a slicing knife. Probably up and back 4 times, just so we've got a tiny little shoulder on there, just to give us a bit of strength, so the knife doesn't collapse on you. But remember, keep the stones clean, use them dry, and keep up that maintenance each time on your coarse bench stone, and you won't prematurely wear out. And remember, don't push down on them stones or you'll prematurely again wear them out. Then find a 600, 1200, and the white stone should really last a year, 2 years really. If your 400 sort of doing your hard work, that will wear out. But if you're doing the job right with this stone, this is cheap. Should be wearing this stone out first rather than doing the work on your small stones. Okay, so we're going to hold it there and we're going to give this knife a bit of a test. We're going to have a bit of fun and see how well it cuts. Okay guys, we've moved out into the workshop area here. We're just going to do a few tests. Don't try this in your workplace. We've done a risk assessment here. Nobody's around. Got my cut-proof gloves on. and we've concluded that we can do this safely here in the workshop, but don't try this in your own workplace. So you'll see a lot of videos where guys are cutting a piece of phone paper, so we're going to see whether this slicing knife will cut the paper. So no problem there, just glides through that effortlessly. So we've got some bottles here, we're going to see whether it's going to cut through them. You'll see this one on YouTube quite often, so we're going to see whether this slicing knife firstly will cut through the bottles, and then we'll see whether it will hold its edge. Okay, here goes. Okay, so cut through them pretty easily. Going to see whether it's still sharp. Knife's wet. So it's still sharp. Cut through all them bottles pretty easy. So that doesn't really prove a lot, but we can see that it's sharp, and it will cut and will hold an edge. So if this video is helpful, make sure you subscribe down below, like it, and keep an eye out, and we'll be putting more of this content up in the future. Thank you.